So far, we've only learned about traits that help organisms to survive in their environment. But evolution is not perfect. It can only modify what organisms already have. And if a trait is no longer useful, then that trait will take a very long time, getting smaller and smaller before it disappears. These are called vestigial traits. One example of this is the ability to wiggle your ears. Unfortunately, if I'm trying to hit on someone, I can't go up to them and say, "Hey, beautiful, can you see me wiggling my ears? Oh yeah, do you want me?" Now, while my ear wiggling gets me nowhere, for some organisms it's quite important. For example, this fennec fox has such good hearing that just by adjusting the angle of its ears slightly, it can hear insects digging underground and then go dig them up to eat them. Humans also have muscles that move their ears, shown here and here. Though mine are particularly strong, it does not improve my fitness in any way. In other words, it's not going to help me have babies. While the fox could use its muscles to better hear its food and thus have more babies in the future. So in human bodies, these muscles are called vestigial traits. In other words, evolutionary remains of once useful traits. There are many other examples of this. Take koalas. They eat eucalyptus leaves, which they digest not only with their small intestine, but with this large structure called a cecum that comes off of it. If you look for a cecum in our digestive tract, all you find is this: a tiny shriveled little structure called an appendix. It does nothing to help us digest at all. In fact, from time to time it gets infected and people need to have their appendix taken out by surgery, and it's no good. So it no longer serves any purpose for us. Of course, we're not eating eucalyptus leaves anymore, so it's fine that our cecum has been shrunk to this tiny structure. But that means it would be considered a vestigial trait for us. One last example of vestigial traits would be our coccyx, or tailbone, which you can see right here at the end of our spine. It's just this little series of bones that have been fused together right at the end of our pelvis. This obviously serves no survival purpose for us, but in other species, say in monkeys, it is quite useful, helping them not fall out of trees while they reach for food on the outermost tips of branches. Surprisingly, our evolutionary heritage sometimes shows when humans get a particular mutation that turns our tail genes back on. So this cute little girl is obviously human. However, due to a mutation that she received, the genes that control tail growth and stop tails from growing in our body was not functional in her, and so her body actually started growing a tail just as our evolutionary ancestors grew tails themselves. And you don't need to wait until babyhood to find evidence for evolution. If you look at embryos, you can see it as well. Just by looking at these drawings of embryos, do you have any clue what they might grow into when they're fully developed? How about now? To me, it's so surprising to think that these species all share such similar early embryos, and it's only later in development that you start to see recognizable differences between, say, turtles and fish and humans. This suggests that all of these vertebrates shared a common ancestor, and likely early in that ancestor's life cycle, their embryos looked like this. It's a commonality that we all share. And then it's only as different genes got turned on in each of these species that it directed the development to be different. In the case of a turtle, to start developing a shell here instead of a dorsal fin, or instead of a plain old backbone like in a human. These embryos would develop or start out so similarly because the genes that direct their development would be similar. And so that's another piece of evidence. If the genes are similar, that suggests that perhaps organisms are closely related. Take this one gene in mice, for example, called PAX6, that directs the development of eyes. It so happens there's a similar gene called eyeless in fruit flies, and another one called the eye control gene in sharks, and the eye control gene in squid, and the eye control gene in flatworms. And look at this. Flatworms, squid, sharks, flies, mice, all of them are so different. But if you look at the actual sequence of nucleotides inside the genes, they're pretty darn similar. Like if you compare a mouse PAX6 gene with a fly eyeless gene, you can find that they are 76.6% identical per letter. Now, with sharks, the percentage is a little bit higher, 85%, and that makes sense because sharks are vertebrates and so are mice, so they probably shared a more recent common ancestor than the mouse did with the fly. But even still, flatworms, which look nothing like mice and don't have a backbone, they're definitely not mammals, they're very unrelated to all these other organisms, still 71% identical. That really suggests that Darwin's idea of common descent was true, because all these organisms are sharing very similar genes with just slight changes. Using these genetic differences, biologists will sketch out how they think different organisms are related, and they don't just have to use DNA. Thanks to the central dogma, they could use proteins as well. In this particular case, they constructed this key looking at a gene for a protein called cytochrome C, and they found that, say, between humans and monkeys, there was only one nucleotide that changed. Whereas between humans and, say, kangaroos, there's 1 plus 7 plus 2 plus 5, so it looks like that's 15 letters that are different. So still not that many letters, but slightly more than monkeys and humans. So they figured, oh, if there's only one letter difference between these two, they must be very related. Whereas if there's 15 differences, that means kind of related, but not quite as closely related. And then obviously there's tons of changes that happen in this protein between bread mold and humans. So bread mold and humans aren't as closely related. The last piece of evidence comes from the fact that humans can create their own version of natural selection called artificial selection. But it functions on the same principle. For example, in the case of the domesticated dog, a subpopulation of gray wolf species began interacting with humans. And over time, humans helped and cooperated with certain dogs that had particular traits until they lived around humans more and more. Then, amongst those populations, dogs with particular characteristics that humans liked, white fluffy fur, a smushy face, a sleek racing form, were bred with each other, eventually generating new breeds. Scientists reason that if humans can artificially select organisms and cause them to evolve, then surely nature could also select them by natural selection instead of artificial selection. Thanks to all this evidence, the transitional form fossils, the biogeography, the homologous structures, the vestigial traits, the embryology, the genetic similarities, and the artificial selection, scientists have reached this 97% consensus that evolution by natural selection is a critical part of how organisms develop on Earth.